Hi, and thank you for joining us for Mastering the Next Generation of DC's Science Standards. I'm Francis Vigent, CEO here at KnowAtom. My background is as a teacher also, first a high school math teacher and then an elementary and middle school STEM specialist, STEM meaning science, technology, engineering, and math. I've been part of KnowAtom for almost 10 years now. We're a company, primarily educators, who are based out of Salem, Massachusetts, just a little north of Boston. And we have been a part of many communities' efforts to improve science and engineering instruction from K through grade 8. And the focus really being on higher order thinking, the idea that students are really taught to think creatively, evaluatively, and analytically best by being put into the role of scientist and engineer in the classroom and having an opportunity to use those skills as they learn about science and engineering and really experience and use the practices of being a scientist and engineer. So when you think about things like curriculum, materials, professional development, that's the real purpose of it, is to bring students into a skill set, really, that they can use as tools to be able to answer any problem, or solve any problem, or answer any questions. So if you think about that, that's the real reason why science and engineering and STEM, or the next generation science standards, are actually part of a K-12 school day. Only about 4% of students will go on to get a science or engineering degree, and whether or not our nation actually needs more of those folks, we could double the number and we would still be at 8%, or quadruple and still be under 20%. So the real reason to teach science and engineering is, one, to build scientific literacy, and really a very close, or perhaps the first reason, close second, is to get these higher order thinking skills, the skills to be able to create, evaluate, and analyze into view for students and into something which is a tool for them and prepares them for any college or career choice that they may have. So not to riff on that too long, but really I want to set that out there not only as our purpose and as the Next Generation Science Standards purpose, but really the purpose of STEM in the K-12 classroom. So as we jump into this webinar, I'd like to just kind of give you a quick outline. We're first going to take a bit of a look at where the District of Columbia is right now, because DC was an early adopter of the Next Generation Science Standards, adopted them really in their entirety. And also DC is the first in the nation to have a NGSS aligned assessment, which is a standardized assessment taking the place of the previous District of Columbia Common Assessment Program assessment for science. So thinking about that, DC has a great opportunity to not only hit the ground running with the standards by being an early adopter, but also to see how those standards are going to be assessed. And we're going to take a quick look at that too as we go through this presentation. So kind of the basic structure is a little bit of thinking around and discussion around what makes the new standards a bit tougher. How do those new standards link to Common Core ELA and math as we think about it from the classroom perspective? How does this change, or how should this change to Next Generation Science Standards affect the classroom teaching as well as learning when we think about instruction in the K-12 classroom? And then in terms of the science time and learning itself, not only how does it connect to Common Core ELA and math, but also how do these skills connect with art? And so we'll talk quickly about that towards the end, and I'll show you a bit of data. So without further ado, let's jump right in here. The first bit is just kind of a quick look at the Science Assessment Blueprint. As of May 2016, I mentioned that DC will be the first in the nation with a next generation aligned science assessment. There are a lot of very closely sort of aligned not maybe totally aligned, but close to alignment models of assessment that are out there. Some are international assessments, like the OECD's PISA assessment would be one, but that's really much more of an upper middle school to high school level assessment, and again, international. Here in the US, we might also look at assessments like the New England Common Assessment Program, which have been used by states such as Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Rhode Island for a number of years, dating back to, around 2007 or so. So models of assessing more than just content have existed for quite some time. One of the unique pieces to what DC has implemented is the idea of taking that assessment and making it something that is a computer-based assessment as well. So DC's assessment event of student performance of the expectations of NGSS, so those are performance expectations, not just standards, falls into three categories. One is a selected response, which is what most would kind of think of as multiple choice. A constructed response, which is something that most folks would refer to perhaps as an open response, and then technology-enhanced items, which, by virtue of this being a computer-based assessment, is something which are drag and drop. For instance, you might have a food chain or food web type model, and I'll show you that in a little bit. And students can drag and drop different objects. Almost, you think about a word bank as something that students might have to, pull words from a word bank and order them. If a word was a herbivore, carnivore, producer, consumer, something like this. Well, in the case of a technology-enhanced item, you can have pictures of those organisms and then ask students to drag and drop the image of the organism into its proper place within a food chain or food web. So, like I said, we'll take a look at that in a little bit. But hats off to DC. I think one of the limitations of computer-based assessments like this are sort of the logistical challenges of the technology itself. What happens when the power goes out? What happens if a student can't touch a screen or has different fine motor issues, certain things like this. But nonetheless, the model itself, if you were to remove the computer, is something that all states are really thinking about, because when you have new standards, you have to assess the standards that you have. And the next generation science standards are something that are moving away from a traditional model of instruction. And that may be one of the things that comes to light in the results of the DC testing, is that this movement from a traditional model to a next generation science model of instruction, and so from a teaching side is a challenge, but also from a learning side, because as students who have learned in a traditional model, the expectations have changed, and so students need to be cognizant of that, because they may view their role in the classroom as well as in testing to be something more of lower order thinking, remembering, applying, basic understanding. And in a traditional model, that's what we produce, because content in a traditional model flows through a teacher who models facts, demonstrates phenomena, and explains what a concept is or what an idea is. And the student's job in that traditional environment is to remember, to be able to recall, to be able to repeat and summarize that phenomenon that they've either seen or read about, and that's how they show proficiency. And so that's why previous assessments were really focused on, really recalling basic facts. For instance, is the plant a producer, consumer, or a herbivore? A student should be able to identify a plant as a producer. So that's really lower order thinking. If you remember that a plant is a producer and you can identify that, it was explained to you, shown to you, you read about it, that fits in, that type of assessment would fit into a traditional model. However, when you think about the next generation science standards, the model of instruction has to change, because those are performance expectations. They are not fact-based standards where a student just has to recall something. So And by involving a practices dimension, which is a skills dimension, students need to develop those skills as a tool that they can use to develop and use the content. So when you look at the relationship between teachers, students, and content, as you see on your screen right now, it's very different than in a traditional model, and I'll snap back to that just so you can see. Remember, the traditional model, content flows through the teacher explains it, student remembers it, and tells it back to the teacher. In the next generation model, students develop those skills, and they use the skills to develop and use the content, which is why you see the relationship between the student and the content this way. The teacher is not in the middle of it, and that's really important. So when you think about developing and using the content, that means that students are working with problems or questions that they have to use the tools and those skills to really uncover, to investigate. And the role of the teacher is very necessary here. The teacher is helping students understand how to engage appropriately as scientists and engineers in the classroom. They're helping gradually adjust student supports. They're identifying student needs, and they are helping to redirect and monitor those students and releasing responsibility. So this next generation inquiry environment cannot exist without skillful teachers in the classroom. It's not something that lends itself to automation, because really it's a culture in many ways that when you think about a next generation model of instruction, you're actually creating a culture of teaching and learning where the student is the scientist and the content and the cross-cutting concepts are something to be explored through the use of the student's skills. And so teachers are taking a step back between the relationship of those two and really working to strengthen it by using their pedagogy. So when you think about something like nonfiction reading now serves the role of providing some basic content background, but then taking that further through skillful teaching and Socratic dialogue so that students are making concept to concept and concept to self and concept to world connections with that content, which they can then use to apply their skills in solving a problem or answering a question authentically, which means that it's their idea. And that's why next generation science standards are so powerful, because it's an opportunity for students to take their ideas and bring them to life. And teachers can provide that environment. And so when you think about how students are assessed and what proficiency means under these new standards in the classroom as well as in standardized testing, students show proficiency by actually developing and using the content, by actually using their skills to solve problems and answer questions. And that doesn't mean that they're always successful at solving the problem or always fully answering or successfully answering the question, but it means that they can demonstrate knowledge of the practices and use them as tools, and knowledge of the disciplinary core ideas, and an ability to identify and use the systems behavior, which is the cross-cutting concepts dimension, in a novel context. And that's why the next generation science assessments, as well as the instructional environment, focus around scenarios. So when you think about curriculum, part of the role of curriculum is really to create robust sequence of scenarios where students can play this role of scientist and engineer and in a novel way, at least novel to them, explore questions and problems and actually engage in the practices, and also not only engaging in the practices because practices are tools, but engage in the processes of science and engineering. The process of science, so the scientific process or the scientific method, is different but equally important as the engineering design process. Engineering serves a different purpose than science, and we actually have definitions for that under the next generation science standards, that science is knowledge from experimentation, that scientists seek to answer questions by developing and using experiments to gather data and then reflect on hypotheses. And the same thing, or a similar thing I should say, for engineers. The engineers play the unique role of solving problems using their knowledge of science. And so engineers identify problems, they research them, they look at their available resources, and they pursue a prototype of a likely solution, or maybe it's unlikely, but one that they think is viable in some way, and they pursue that prototype, test it under real circumstances, get the data, and then use that data to form a database conclusion about whether or not the technology solves the problem. So different processes, and the difference between practices and processes, not to riff on this too long, is if you've ever taught ELA to students, think about the writing practices being word choice, voice, and things like this, and the writing process as being pre-write, peer review, revise, and then publish. That process helps writers go from an idea to a high-quality published work. The practices like word choice and voice within writing are tools to be a skillful writer and engage in that process and so on. Same thing for science. There are practices, the kind of tools to be a skillful scientist or engineer, and then there are processes in order to go from a problem or a question to an evidence-based conclusion. So those need to be part of the instructional environment. Really, students using the processes and practices need to be the core of instruction. That needs to be how students learn the material. Taking a reading-based, and I don't want to say literacy-based, because when students are developing plans, they're actually generating a nonfiction text and they process writing. So that is literacy-oriented. But to take a reading-oriented approach through textbooks and sort of, read everything, remember it all, and then, then do a culminating activity doesn't fly. That's not the way to approach this. The other thing to think about is that a lot of sort of kit-based models work around, instead of the teacher doing the demonstration, the students have some materials and they follow something that's given to them, whether it's a picture with steps or a procedure with steps or so on. So basically that's really taking a teacher demonstration and just making it the students demonstrating it to themselves the way that the teacher would. Instead of following the teacher's instruction, they're following the instruction on a piece of paper. That's not planning and investigation. That's not authentic. So that's really some key differentiators here you need to think about as you are trying to improve your scores under the new DC assessments, as well as trying to align your instruction to this next generation model of inquiry. And if you are interested to see what some of those resources look like, you can visit KnowAtom.com/resources. You see there's a link at the top of the page. You can go there too. You can look at KnowAtom.com and go to the top of the page, and there is a STEM curriculum link there. You can download some examples, one at least per grade level for grades 1 through 8. So when you think about those standards, this is what they look like, right? And you can see this is a performance expectation because it's what students who demonstrate understanding are able to perform. And it exists in a context of 3 dimensions, which you see here. And that classroom, really, that classroom experience needs to create an environment where these 3 dimensions come to life simultaneously as a kind of scenario or experience where students can attempt to perform the expectation and learn from that attempt. And that's key, is that our instruction is an opportunity to learn from an attempt. What are the practices? The practices dimension is probably the most revolutionary for educators. Disciplinary core ideas are a better set of content than we've had in the past. It all relates, it's interrelated. Cross-cutting concepts is system behavior, but skillful educators are aware that you don't just see things like cycles within the water cycle. We see life cycles, we see rock cycles, we see all of those sort of things. So things like cross-cutting concepts, which is system behavior, describing systems in terms of their components and their interaction, is something that folks have been doing. It's not entirely new. The practices are going to be new to a lot of people, not necessarily everybody, and they're going to be familiar here or there, or sound like a good idea, things that we should be doing. But the thing is that it's not on teachers, that the practices are things that are on kids. Kids need to have these as skills. So the idea that a student can, from scratch, develop a model to describe a phenomenon is a skill they need to have, not developing a model that you showed them. And that's a really important distinction. That means the teacher has the skill, but we need the students to have the skill. So what do those STEM practices look like? At a high level, there are these 8 STEM practices. So a student needs to be able to not only follow questions and problems and hear about them, but actually ask them, define them. And also I'd be able to identify, and you see here for science and engineering, that understanding that there is a nature of science where scientists ask questions and then pursue developing planned experiments to gather data and answer those questions. And in the case of problems, that engineers attempt to solve problems. So even at the practice level, you can see that they're hinting at that nature of the relationship between science and engineering. Not only using a model, but students need to be able to develop it, not only carry out investigations, but students need to be able to plan it, and that's themselves. Okay? Not only interpreting data, but analyzing it, applying math through computational thinking and operations that they've learned. So there's a connection here, which I'll show you, between Common Core math and ELA practices that connect here. And the math practices very closely mirror the STEM practices that you see and what's required in this next generation inquiry environment. Engaging in argument from evidence, that's evidence-based writing, but also defense of our thoughts in a sort of skillful, collegiate sort of way, and not, in a bullying argument sense. So that's what they mean here, is really an academic argument. And then obtaining and evaluating communicating information, which I hope seems like it should be part of all of this, but they actually make sure that that's a separate practice in and of itself, so that you are aware that without communicating, obtaining, and evaluating information that you generate as a result of a planned investigation, then you aren't really engaging in science or engineering. So in the classroom at an early level, it looks very similar to what it looks like at an upper level as well. Students are working with ideas, with concept connections that they've built through the nonfiction reading, Socratic dialogue, things like this, and they're authentically trying to answer a question or solve a problem. And whether they're second graders or fifth graders, it doesn't matter. Those practices are consistent throughout the grade levels. And what changes is the sophistication with which students apply them and the types of responses you can expect, and the sort of sophistication of the scenarios that you can present, the number of variables that can be a part of a situation, things like that. So these 2 students are engaged as engineers. They've gone through the nonfiction reading, their Socratic dialogue, they've come to a problem, and they're now thinking about that problem as partners and trying to come up with an approach to it that they can prototype and test, gather data, and then reflect back on whether that prototype really solves the problem. And so that's what they're doing here in their blank composition notebooks. And so they're not copying something from the board. It's coming from their own ideas. And that's key. It's key for it's key for the learning to be authentic and the environment and so on, but it's really key to student engagement. It's really no fun to copy anybody, and it's really not very engaging to just repeat what you've heard or what you've seen. So when there are engagement issues, that tends to be the issue. So consider releasing responsibility. When you think about the connection between science and the other disciplines, you can see here that science overlaps with math and ELA through those technical Common Core state standards for ELA, nonfiction reading, communication, writing, so on. Under Common Core math, certainly there are a number of standards that are engaged within the science environment, but those math practices are huge, and we'll take a look at what those look like in a moment. They are very closely related to the expectations of the science and engineering practices, but really the expectations of that inquiry environment. So the only things that are really science time on learning are the experimenting and prototyping themselves. The skills of creating, evaluating, and analyzing those higher order thinking skills that happen simultaneously are common to all disciplines and all careers. And that's key, because we could add to this, beefed up Venn diagram here, we could add art, we could add social studies. There are a lot of things we could add to this which would have overlap into all these disciplines and would have those higher order thinking skills in common. So really a big part of integration is thinking, really at the center of all of it. So if your students aren't required to think, expect low test scores, because they're going to have a hard time understanding the expectations of thinking in these next generation aligned assessments. And beyond that, they're going to have a hard time finding relevance, they're going to have a hard time being engaged, and they're going to have a hard time making connections between concepts and between disciplines. One of the big interesting shifts in the standards is really this focus on higher order thinking that I keep talking about. Creating, evaluating, and analyzing happen simultaneously in a next generation inquiry environment, and happen nearly simultaneously in a next generation testing environment. So when you think about previous tests, they were really focused on lower order thinking. For instance, can you remember the plant? What's its relationship in a food chain or food web? Is it the producer? Is it the consumer? Is it the, is it a detritivore or something like this? So that just requires remembering. Understanding, just making sense out of information. So if we show a picture of animals and trees and plants in a forest, can the student interpret the relationship between the parts, kind of point out the food chain or food web members in that picture? Applying, would be to kind of look at a situation like that and to say, well, if a invasive species is introduced, how might that change, the food chain or food web? And in fact, the example I just gave is a bit more analyzing than just applying. Applying, evaluating, creating is at the highest level and not typically part of those past assessments, because really it relies on something new, a new idea, whether it's a judgment, a new approach, which is really creating, judgment being evaluating, or comparing and contrasting and looking at the relationships and how they impact each other, which is why I said that example of how an invasive species with certain characteristics might affect an ecosystem would, any explanation around that would require creating the explanation and then analyzing, as part of that, analyzing the environment and presenting a well-formed argument, which would also involve evaluating and analyzing the data in writing. So you can see creating, evaluating, and analyzing would happen simultaneously that way. So mastering the next generation of DC science standards really requires the classroom to be an opportunity where creating, evaluating, and analyzing happen simultaneously and are really the fabric and mode of instruction on an everyday basis authentically, so that there's that full release of responsibility to students, and they're coming to checkpoints and having accountability on a regular basis throughout a class. But it's not a situation of lecture, it's a situation of investigation. So back to those key action items in DC, where we've got this standardized test that's now in play, and the assumption is that K-12 schools have implemented or will implement materials with fidelity that are aligned to NGSS. Where that hasn't happened, it's going to become obvious, and here's how. when you look, and this even goes back to, these are examples that were released in 2015, which are still relevant to the 2016 implementation, you'll see that here there's Trevor and Kayla, and they are being inserted as part of a scenario that is presented to your student in this assessment. So the scenario is that they've planted plants in their classroom, and that they created some little device to put the plants in, and there's a basic hypothesis here, which is not called a hypothesis, but it is a hypothesis as to whether plants in water and nutrients called hydroponics will grow as well or differently than plants that are grown in soil within the same sort of physical structure with the same sort of treatment. And so they give a little bit of an example of how the system was designed, what it looks like, there's a picture here, and then what the procedure looked like that the students carried out in order to get those plants to grow. And what they're trying to highlight here is the only difference is the water in the soil, that they were watered and given the same amount of sunlight, and they were in the actually, what's kind of interesting here is that there's a little bit of a situation where there's a hydroponic system versus a soil in a garden. So there are multiple variables. One is the system itself, the cut bottle, the other being so cut bottle versus no cut bottle, right, being planted in the ground versus in a bottle. But on the other side, there's also this water versus soil. So you actually have two variables here. Nonetheless, it's up to the student to, first of all, identify that. Second of all, to be able to see and understand the scenario, understand the basics of the hypothesis, and then be able to look at the data that was gathered, because Trevor and Kayla measured at similar intervals, at the same intervals, the stem height. So one of the weaknesses here is they aren't showing what the stem is, so a student would have to know what a stem is. But to look at the stem height and to try and figure out if there is a difference in how the plants grow in the two environments. So they're told that Trevor and Kayla make claims. Trevor makes the claim that the bean plants grow faster in soil in the garden because soil provides nutrients for plants to grow. And Kayla comes to the conclusion that bean plants grow better in water in the soda bottle because water provides the nutrients for plants to grow. So the question of the student here is to, or the expectation, which they lay out, study the data in the tables and Trevor and Kayla's claims, and they ask the student whose claim is correct, Trevor or Kayla. Explain why Kayla or Trevor's claim is correct. Use evidence to support your choice. So this is an example of a constructed response. So if a student has mastered the performance expectations related to this scenario, if they have mastered the practices dimension, so they have the tools to be able to look at the scenario, to be able to identify the key parts, what's the question or what's the problem, what's the data, what data do I need to take from this, or actually analyze, how do I analyze this data that's been given to me to come up with some key data points that I can use as evidence to support my claim and my reasoning about whether Kayla's claim is true or false, or Trevor's claim is true or false, or supported by the data in this experiment. Because what the question's really asking is for an evidence-based conclusion, which involves stating the hypothesis, making a claim about it, and using data to support that claim from the actual experiment. And in this case, it's not an experiment that your student has carried out. It's an experiment that other students have carried out and that they have explained through this scenario. So that's mastery. Okay, that's taking practices and understanding the process of how you go from a question or a problem and come to an evidence-based conclusion, and furthermore, being able to use those skills and the understanding of those processes to evaluate the claims of others and actually to give an evidence-based argument. So it's really big deal, a big shift from where standardized assessment was previously in DC. Now, this is not, these types of constructive response and scenarios not the only type of question, but you'll see that the narrative builds because here Trevor and Kayla are still part of the storyline in item 2 and in item 3, yet the one on the left is what's considered technology enhanced. It's one of those drag and drop examples where, okay, we can drag and drop the lettuce, the snake, the grasshopper to show where they belong here in this food web, but then there's also a constructed response. Explain how your model shows the shortest way that the energy from plants gets to the fox. Now the thing here is that the choice, and it was kind of interesting, is that the way this is constructed, the students don't really have a choice of how to create this model. They're really dragging and dropping the pictures of the organisms into what you see here, this food chain, food web. However, let's just reframe this a little bit so it's a better question. So explain the shortest path for, or explain which is the longest or least efficient path for energy to travel in this food chain or food web, in which you would see there's actually 2 of them or 3 of them here, and actually you start to see 4. There are 4 steps here. If you go from this organism up this way, through the center, and through the side, you could potentially end up with 4 stages in that food chain, versus if you go from this organism up, which is probably something like the fox. It'd be kind of interesting, but you could have something like a fox, a grasshopper, and a lettuce leaf or something like that, or fox, rabbit, lettuce leaf, and that would be the shortest path there with only 3 stages. So, and explain why that is, because the energy and matter doesn't have to travel through more than 3 stages or 2 hops really. There's only 2 transfers versus 3 in all others. So nonetheless, that's the kind of reasoning a student has to go through and be able to go through in this type of assessment. Over here in item 3, there's this food chain that's shown. It's explained, and then students are asked in a selected response, multiple choice is what that translates into, to identify 3 correct answers about the movement of matter in the food pond food chain. There's then a constructed response. Use the model of the food pond chain to describe the relationship between the organisms in the pond food chain and the exchange of matter back into the environment. And of course you know that bacteria is here as a decomposer. So students are able to talk about a life cycle as well as part of this. So really, what's the expectation here is that students are going to be able to think of the parts as well as the system, where not only do you have the parts of the food chain, but you also have the system of the food chain itself, energy from the sun passing to the heron, and then the actual life cycles within this food chain, which allow for the recycling of matter and energy as well, which is actually part of kind of a different food chain, which involves the bacteria. So a much different style of assessment. A couple other examples of simple food chain, kind of that drag and drop, technology enhanced item, right? You can't drag and drop on paper, but you can on a screen. Number 5, coming back to another scenario, but in this case, which of the following statements best explains why composted soil is good for plants in the garden and the environment? Select 3 correct answers. Okay, multiple choice, but again involves a scenario. It's going to require the student to have that tool set to look at this novel scenario, take what they've learned in the classroom, and demonstrate the performance expectation. Okay. Thinking about the difference between practices and processes again, really important. When a student understands the process of science or the process of engineering, they need to understand both, they're better able to identify what is being asked of them in these questions. And that's really key, a key consideration here. Because otherwise it just kind of seems like a story and, well, what's being asked of me? You know, how do I think about this story? I know I could, you know, analyze some data. I know I could, you know, use some data, but how do I do that to go from, you know, the question or problem that's being, or the scenario that's being shown to me in order to have an intelligent and data-based response to it, okay? So your classroom hopefully is relating those, or creating an environment, I shouldn't say relating, but really creating an environment where students are experiencing or being given the opportunity to engage the content in this way already, so that they've already mastered it by the time they get to these assessments. I mentioned earlier about Common Core ELA technical subject standards, and this is just an example of some and how they relate to that type of environment which is being assessed in the standards. Citing specific textual evidence to support analysis, summarizing text distinct from prior knowledge, following precisely a multi-step procedure. And I just want to point out that that's an ELA standard, not a science standard. So if you're handing a procedure to students, they're following a multi-step procedure when they're carrying out the experiment. That's ELA, not science. Okay, science is developing the procedure. When they carry it out by following it precisely, that's when they're actually carrying out an ELA expectation. Information being expressed visually, so think about graphing the data, analyzing the data in a non-numerical sense, or in a sort of a quasi-numerical visual, you know, sense when we think about charts or so on. Distinguishing among fact, reason, judgment, and research findings, and speculation in research findings. And that's huge because when you think back to that scenario, that's what they were assessing. Two students made a claim, and your student on the test was being asked to distinguish among the facts and the claims of those students and to look at them in terms of, are they evidence-based? Why or why not? How? Show me that you have evidence to contradict one of these claims. Is it a speculation? Is it an opinion? Is it simply false? That is achieving not only science goals, but ELA goals as well. The Common Core math practices I mentioned earlier are closely related because students are making sense of problems in this next generation inquiry environment. They're reasoning abstractly and quantitatively. They're constructing viable arguments and critiquing the reasoning of others. They're modeling with math. They're using tools strategically and appropriately. And a tool is not just something physical like a hammer. A process is a tool. Okay? Data is a tool. There are lots of different tools. Operations are tools. Mean, median, and mode are each tools. Attending to precision. I think that's a criticism of the assessment example I showed you earlier, where in fact this assessment, these procedures lack precision. Okay, Trevor and Kayla planted their bean plants at the same time. Okay, Trevor plants his plants in the soil in the garden. Okay, she planted her plants in a water bottle. Fine. They water their plants every 2 to 3 days. Not so good. Is it 2 or is it 3? Pick one. And how much did they water them? This is all important. It lacks precision because there's nothing here to indicate the chronology, order, and number of steps that are here in this procedure. Students' plants both receive the same amount of sunlight each day. You know, that's okay, but it would be really nice to know how much sunlight the plants were allowed each day. It's not necessarily relevant, but it doesn't model, this example does not model use of precision very well. So looking for and expressing regularity and repeated reasoning. So we call that recursive steps. That is part of having efficient procedures, and it's not something we would have seen in that example I just showed you, because the experiment didn't call for it. But if you are doing repeated trials of something, instead of having a procedure that's 15 steps long, having a 6-step procedure where 5 steps are repeated 3 times. So you have a separate step that says, repeat steps 1 through 5 for 2 more trials. That reduces a 15-step procedure to a 6-step procedure. Okay, so that is looking for and expressing regularity and repeated reasoning. Highly skilled practice, and something that is relevant to both Math Common Core as well as science. So why is it that these types of differences are kind of coming to the forefront under next generation science standards? And the answer to that is that there's a movement from what you see on the left in that picture to what you see on the right. That traditional inquiry environment is going away. You can see the teachers having a great time, but it's kind of interesting that even though this is photo stock, the kids don't look all that engaged. They're watching, but she's got a much bigger smile on her face than they do. And in that pre-teaching demonstrating model, what's happening is that students are trying to remember what's being shown to them so that they can repeat it back. In the scenario on the right, maybe we don't have big smiles or whatever, but what's happening here is that students are taking what they know, their experience, what they've read a bit about, what they've discussed in class, and they now have a problem they need to solve. They've never seen how this problem is solved before. So it's authentic to them, to their ideas as a team, and success really relies on them using their tools in those practices and carrying out a scientific or engineering process to go from that problem, in the case of engineering it would be the engineering design process, but to go from that problem to an evidence-based claim, really, but it's a prototype which can be scaled as a technology that solves the problem. So they have to prototype first to gather data and then make a claim about that prototype. Does it actually solve the problem, and how? Why? And so that's why you see them with these blank composition notebooks in front of them, because they are planning their investigation first. Yeah, there's materials, but they're not building anything yet. They're just looking at those materials to get a sense of what's maybe possible here. What do I have available to work with to try and design a solution? Okay, that's what's key. And this definition of effective STEM instruction comes from the National Research Council. And the National Research Council was a big part, especially of the early foundations of the next generation science standards, in establishing what effective K-12 STEM instruction looks like, what those practices are, where they are, that sort of a thing. And then that formed the foundation for the next generation science standards, which were then drafted, published, and have been adopted in DC and elsewhere. So I'd like to read that definition, just unpack it a bit for you. So effective science instruction capitalizes on students' early interests and experiences. It identifies and builds on what they know and provides them with experiences to engage them in the practices of science and sustain their interest. And what's key in unpacking this is that science starts early. It starts in pre-K kindergarten, not just in a test here. If if you're tested in grade 5 and grade 8 and grade 10 or high school bio, whatever, and that's when you start teaching science, you failed as a district or at least as a school, to have effective STEM instruction, because it starts early and it starts with students' interests and experiences. It identifies and builds on those intentionally. This is a nurturing process. And the way you do that is to have a specific scope and sequence where you are scaffolding concepts from September through June and then from one grade level to the next, so that educators in first grade are supporting educators in second grade, and second grade supporting third grade, and so on and so forth, so that students are going from fourth grade into fifth grade and being tested, having had this nurturing in place and skillful. There's a difference between standards and curriculum. What you don't want to do is cover a standard in a grade level. Science doesn't work that way. What you want to do is group the standards and continually be going over standards from the grade level, as well as, and a grade level meaning where there are grade-specific standards. You want to master those in those grades, but you also want to be introducing and reinforcing the standards from other grades as well, because you have student transients, you have students who are, at different points developmentally. They may have absenteeism issues. You don't want something to be a once and done opportunity for students, and if they weren't there or they didn't get it, for it to then be a gap in their understanding. So this nurturing process, building on what students know, having that be horizontal within the year and vertical from year to year is important. And then this is the most important piece, I think, of all, and underline practices here because that's a very intentional word. Giving students the opportunity to experience and engage in the practice, the experiences to engage them in the practices of science, and we could say engineering, and sustain their interest. Having a rigorous scope and sequence so that students are being put into these scenarios on a regular basis, and that those scenarios are the opportunity and the mode of instruction, so the students aren't learning by reading. You don't learn to be a scientist by reading about science. You learn to be a scientist by actually being a scientist, by developing the skills. And you need to know about science, but that's a small piece of it. There are many other pieces, which is why the disciplinary core ideas are one of 3 dimensions related to the performance expectation. Okay? And sustaining that momentum, that rigor, actually sustains student interest. The release of responsibility sustains student interest. That environment where students are authentically planning and then carrying out their plans is engaging them in the practices. So that's why this is what the next generation inquiry environment looks like. That's why we've designed at least our curriculum to function that way. And hopefully you've designed your curriculum to function that way as well. So there are those different readiness levels, awareness being the kind of resource that you could download from the internet, from a museum, from a company that says, hey, here's what an engineer is, and you can do this, it's a kind of your typical 2-page lesson plan. That's awareness ready. As a result, a student could raise their hand and say, I know an engineer solves problems, but they haven't developed any skills to actually solve problems themselves. Okay, they're just aware of that being the role of an engineer. Knowledge readiness is something that textbooks are often, associated with, or online textbooks, or wikis and things like this. Knowledge readiness is associated with knowing all about what scientists and engineers have discovered, or scientists have discovered and engineers have solved, the technology that they've produced. So here you know about science and about engineering, but again, you don't have the skills as a student to engage in actually solving a problem or answering a question. You just know about what others have done. Performance readiness is where you start to get into things like kits, where students learn how to perform a task related to a very specific need. Like, if I need to know how hard a rock or mineral is, I will carry out the task of a scratch test. And so I'll take that rock or mineral and I will scratch it on different surfaces, and that will help me to determine the hardness of that rock or mineral. So that's performance readiness, performing a task relevant to some specific need. Mastery readiness is what is required to perform on those types of assessments that I showed you earlier. A student has developed a skill set that is useful in any context and is actually kind of context as agnostic, we might call it. And they understand the processes of science and the processes of engineering and are able to use them skillfully and identify when they're appropriate. Which is appropriate when, I guess, is the way to put that. So in the case of mastery readiness, which presents students with a novel scenario, like one of those scenarios you've seen, they'll be able to think about arguing from evidence, for instance, and look at somebody else's argument, attend to precision, be able to analyze the data and evaluate the claims, and actually extract, first of all, not only identify all of these pieces, but be able to come up with a claim of their own about somebody else's claim, extract the relevant data from the scenario to support that claim, and then, of course, to be able to kind of reason that out in writing. So that is mastery readiness. That's what we here at KnowAtom aim for. That's what these assessments are looking for. And so your classroom, your curriculum should be aimed at mastery readiness. Anything less is just that. It's less, and it will leave a gap that should be detectable in these new assessments. So when you think about things like curriculum, professional development, and materials, their job is to enable that STEM learning environment where students are the scientist, where they are the engineer, and they are actually engaged in the performance expectations, actually attempting them and developing their understanding through that process. So curriculum, professional development, materials is not sort of standalone. They all have to be interconnected, and they serve the purpose of the standards in linking the standards together and creating an experience where students can attempt the performance expectations and learn from those attempts. The nice thing is, and I'm not pitching KnowAtom here, but when these parts are all provided by the same group like KnowAtom, then what happens is they fit hand in glove, at least they should. And that, in the case of KnowAtom, everything is engineered September through June so that teachers can link up with their peers. They can provide a successful experience for students. Students' learning is, from a user experience standpoint, very consistent from one grade level to the next, so that the practices, the processes, the definitions, and so on are not moving all over the place. And in fact, when we refer to something, a rock by a specific definition, that we hold that definition constant over time. And what is science? What is engineering? What is the process that scientists engage in? What is the process that engineers engage in, and so on? That's important because it removes opportunities for confusion from that learning environment. And what's great is it really frees teachers up to take time that they would otherwise, and money as well, that they would otherwise be spending on materials and finding materials and downloading lesson plans and trying to mash things together and get them to fit quite right. To repurpose that time to really focus on meeting student needs, redirecting, monitoring, honing their own pedagogy and skills so that they're connecting with students on a deeper level through Socratic dialogue and things like that. So it's a great opportunity. It's a challenge. It doesn't remove the time necessary for science, but with the right resources, the challenge changes from all of the above to just meeting student needs and the teaching and learning in the classroom, which, if you have scarce time and you had to spend it all somewhere, hopefully that's where you choose to spend it versus, finding materials and meshing, different lesson plans that are downloaded together. So if you'd like to take a look at any examples of that, you can check that out at KnowAtom.com. I'll give you a link to that. I mentioned the idea of STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and math. So the connection between art and science and engineering, technology, and math really is thinking. In a culture, as I mentioned earlier, that there's a culture that you build. It's an inquiry culture in your classroom. And the thing is that artists rely on the same higher order thinking skills that scientists and engineers rely on to create, evaluate, and analyze. Art is engineered communication. Real art is engineered communication. So artists are making statements, and they're making those statements through a medium like oil on canvas, like sculpture, like a photograph or a print. So when you think about that, and and again, it's not just that type of art either. It can be through a written work. English language arts, we call them English language arts for a reason, because they are actually an art. They're intended to communicate something to somebody. So music the same. I know folks are, what about music? Yes, music is the same. So the piece of this, though, that I want to emphasize is that both science and art rely on a culture of critique, and learning the disciplines really rely, and being effective in the disciplines rely on a culture of critique. And what I mean by that is that when students are engaged as scientists and engineers in your classroom, you should be holding expectations high and having checkpoints and such so that students are coming to you with their ideas and presenting them at different milestones, and you are helping critique that. You're asking them questions. That's how Socratic dialogue works. So when you think about even before students are planning, when students are engaged in Socratic dialogue, what they're doing is they're coming to each other, they're coming to the class with their ideas and offering them, and other students are going to consider those ideas and agree or disagree, but as part of that, offer support or appropriate criticism of it, providing evidence on either side. And so that culture of critique is really the engine of sort of producing the next generation of artists and scientists and engineers. And when you think about art as engineered communication, the reason I pull up Pablo Picasso's Guernica is that Pablo Picasso and Guernica are probably the most famous and well-known artists and work of art. And Pablo Picasso made Guernica as a statement to the fascists and to the world about the atrocities committed by fascists at Guernica while he was in exile. And this was a statement he made through oil on canvas in a piece that was sent to this international exposition where the world would see it. And what's interesting is the message was loud and clear. The fascists came back to them, and they actually, at least this is the story that's told, the fascists came back to him and said, hey, what did you do? And he said, I didn't do it, you did. And so what he was saying, even though it wasn't in words, it was on oil and canvas, was clearly heard by the fascists and really seen and internalized, and they, in fact, responded to that. And so when you think about why artists go to jail sometimes if they happen to be in the wrong place, or sometimes they are almost martyred. There are bloggers in places like Bangladesh presently who, whose lives are threatened, and many have been killed for speaking out in ways that are unpopular to people. And they do that, in the case of a blogger, through writing, and others have done it through works of art like this and musical pieces and so on. So there is a very deep connection. I get concerned when I hear people talk about STEAM, that science, technology, engineering, and art connection, because they get stuck in aesthetics, the idea that we should make everything pretty. And I can assure you that no artist has ever gone to jail or been killed for making something pretty. But they have run into those circumstances in the wrong places for making a statement by being very skilled at engineering communication within a medium and targeting a message at certain groups of people who found that message something that they didn't like, and brought their disgust back to the artist in some way that was objectionable, probably to us here in within the U.S. certainly, as we think about freedom of speech and things like that. So really think about that connection, because when you think about the fact that that's the English language and the way that we produce a writing piece is an art, and that relies on this type of critical thinking, and that science and engineering is an opportunity to develop those skills. What you're teaching students is really life skills and skills to participate in a democracy, really, and to be scientifically literate citizens, but also artistically literate as well. So when you think about the skills you're teaching in science and engineering, you're also teaching students skills that are going to make them better or more adept, I guess I would say, not better, but more adept consumers and creators of communication, of art, really. So I'll leave art on that note, but something to really think about. So what happens when you teach these types of skills, use this next generation inquiry environment, when you have a full release of responsibility on students and you hold the expectations high and students learn by being scientists and engineers? Well, what we've found through KnowAtom is you get giant data bumps. So here's an example from New Hampshire where there's a couple of years being compared. The taller bars here on this bar graph are our cohort of students, and then here's the state average, and you can see that progressively the students, they get much stronger. They are performing upwards of 20% or so above the state average. And this is an example from New Hampshire. When you look at the subgroups, and the New Hampshire New England Common Assessment Program is very similar to the DC assessment that's aligned to next generation science standards, particularly within the inquiry portion. And it's actually a great model that we've used in the past as well to really think about what these next generation science standards entail. But nonetheless, you can see these taller, the purple here, the violet dark purple, and the yellow, these taller bars, show how our students were performing against their peers in the state average, and you can see they really outperform, especially when it comes to things like inquiry, by more than 20% in some cases, upwards of 30%. And in places like Massachusetts, even in environments like this, where you have 75% high needs and 35% students where their first language is not English, 72% low income, you see the trend is positive, that over the course of 2.5 years, this particular school added 51 points. The state average is 50% proficient and advanced, and this is an inner city school with quite the challenges, and they are, in some points, almost doubling the state average. These corrections that you see are changes in district administration, changes in school, in teachers in the school and so on, but nonetheless what you see is improvement, and it's dramatic and it's retained. That's the thing, is when you have these kind of shocks, the students are not returning to zero or returning to their initial levels. There's some mean reversion, but nonetheless it picks up and actually exceeds in the next year. So really a great opportunity when you think systemically like this, when you have great curriculum that's scaffolding appropriately and teaching the skills and putting it back on the students so the students really are able to perform the expectations, even under existing, or what would be now the previous sort of testing that you see, students perform really well. In the opposite type of environment where there's only 7% low income and 20% high needs, you can still see giant data gains, double digit in the first years, and then they're sustained over time, similar here. Okay, little corrections, but again, the trend continues. Very low levels of warning and failing students. Okay, this is one of the highest schools in the state. Again, someone who's using KnowAtom, and you can see that they are actually the highest school of its size in the state, district even, and they are reaching levels of about 90% proficient, almost double. I mean, the state average again is 50%, so to be at 90% is pretty good. And a middle school I like to point out too, over the course of 2 years, adding about 21 points or 24 points to their advanced and proficient here, and really actually are at the point of their peers in this particular urban district. If you average other urban districts in Massachusetts, they have, in the course of 2 years, 2.5 years, have reached that point with really dramatic, needy population, 95% low income, 64% first language is not English, 97% high needs, 87% free lunch. So again, you can look here, big gains. And look what happens to the warning. Look at how dramatically that drops, basically in half. So really huge when you think of it that way. And then when you think of it from an accountability standpoint, I'll take that same school, you can see here how the school is meeting its accountability threshold set by the state and even closely approaching them so that they are still awarded points for approaching the benchmarks, in some cases exceeding the benchmarks. So that really helps the accountability metrics for the school, and directly or indirectly as well for the teachers, because as you think about wanting to have a high-performing school and school district, well, DC is kind of unique in the sense of its district thing, I guess, but nonetheless, what you have here is positive performance across all subgroups in such a way that you can shine and your schools can really shine as well. So I will leave it there. If you'd like to see more of this, you can go and check out some resources on our website. I will give you a couple links. There is a second part to the series where we take a much closer look at strategically implementing the next generation science standards as you think about whether you're developing your own resources or you've adopted some resources and they aren't quite fitting, or so on and so forth. You can go to KnowAtom.com/strategically. You can just type that in, and you can register and view for free the next sort of piece of this where we take a closer look at strategically implementing those standards. If you have questions on curriculum or anything of that nature, feel free to reach out to Mary Ellen DeLacy, STEM curriculum specialist here at KnowAtom. She's great, and you can get her at mdelacy@knowatom.com. You can also call 617-475-3475, extension 2006. That's another way you can reach her. Resources I could also point you to is NGSS aligned curriculum samples and reader samples that we have available at KnowAtom. You can just go to knowatom.com/curriculum, scroll down a little bit, and you'll see we have there for first grade through 8th grade, free samples you can download of complete teacher units and student readers. And we have much more than that. Those other ones are available for purchase, so feel free to reach out to Mary Ellen or myself, and we can get you the right person if you are at a point where you're trying to purchase or implement something that you didn't create yourself. You can also take a closer look at some of those data examples I gave and look at subgroups in schools by downloading a free case study we have available looking at particularly urban schools by going to knowatom.com/results. And you can stay connected to us with all kinds of free resources by subscribing to our blog, knowatom.com/blog, or on Facebook, facebook.com/knowatom, or on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @knowatom. And there's a whole bunch of other resources, including free, live, and on-demand interviews and webinars, everything from webinars about Socratic dialogue, ebooks, all kinds of stuff, if you go to knowatom.com/resources. I hope this has been helpful, and I hope again that you will join us for the next in this series, part 2, the strategically implementing NGSS, by going to knowatom.com/strategically. Again, I'm Francis Vigent, a former teacher and co-founder here at KnowAtom. We are located in Salem, Massachusetts, and we hope that you will reach out if there's any way that we can be of help, and we hope that you enjoy the resources we have available online. Thank you for your time, and enjoy your day.